Okay, we spent a lot of time. So the overall theme of the conference being this question of balance, and other panels have hit on that topic from a lot of different perspectives, and we're gonna do the same thing here as we look at it at a different angle. So when you think about the Colorado's water plan, you think about has this really how has it affected you? There's 8 sets of objectives in Colorado's water plan, and I think in our minds, one question is: are we balanced in those different things? We spent a lot of time talking about cutting the M&I gap from 560,000 down to 0 by 2030. That's really, it's no problem for this group. Everybody's kind of on top of that, right? And that shouldn't be an issue. Conserving 400,000 acre feet. Kevin Reedy's got that. I think he did that on his lunch hour last month. 400,000 acre feet of water storage, funding $3 billion shortfall, between Mike Broad and if they can write poetry like that, they can pretty totally handle us, and Kirk Russell. There's a number of education objectives in that, so we have eight categories, and so one of which is education. Jayla's group has that. It's all that's easy stuff. We'll just kind of check that off, right? So we're going to now, Kelly, we'll bring up our polling question. And so we're going to talk about 3 of the objectives, and we're going to interplay with those 3 objectives. So if you break out your phone again, and remember we have to text 2 2s and 3 3s. Is that right? 2 2 3 3 to Northern Water. So we're going to talk about 3 different objectives here that we haven't. We spent a lot of time on the other 5 over the years, last couple of years. So when you're thinking about the Colorado's water plan, which ones do you think the highest probability of success are? If you think it's A, covering rivers and watersheds by either a stream management plan or a watershed protection plan, covering 80% of those that are locally prioritized by 2030. The other one, so that's text A if that. Text B, if you think about communities incorporating water-saving actions in land use planning, that 75% of Coloradans will live in a community that has incorporated water-saving actions in land use planning. And the last one is sharing 50,000 acre feet through alternative transfer methods. So by 2030, I think is an objective of that. So let's see what you got. So most people think that integrating land use planning is going to be easier to achieve. So integrating water-saving actions and land use planning will be easier to achieve. So thank you, Kelly. So one of the questions is out here, when we're thinking about what a healthy stream is, or even a healthy watershed, we're going to talk tomorrow a lot about forest health, and that's become a big priority for our Federal Affairs Committee. But when we're thinking about what's natural, and Peter's going to spend some time on that, but when our water use has fundamentally altered both our streams and our watersheds, and our activities, including land management, have changed habitats. We've introduced new species, new fish species, all kinds of new plants and animals into the landscape. But as we're kind of considering stream and management, stream and watershed planning, how do we think about this in terms of, what's really kind of become a new urban? If you, in our office, you kind of look out and get a pretty good view of the whole metro area, and you just look at this urban forest that's out there that didn't exist 100 years ago. And you think about how the landscape has changed that Bob will spend a lot of time talking about in the rural area, as our other speakers will as well. But when you're thinking about that, are we going to be in the idea of prioritizing one type of landscape or one type of water use? It's a fundamental premise of the Colorado Water Congress that we're equally supporting all types of water use. But are you, as you're getting to that, are we getting to the point where we're prioritizing one type of water use or one type of land use over another? As you kind of heard a little bit from the last panel, and we begun thinking about that, if you think about most of our water infrastructure is designed around a certain climate, right? And if you think you want to start designing you're going to change that criteria of what you design your infrastructure. Spillways are designed to pass a certain flow. Our stormwater systems are designed around a certain thing. Just even our gutters and our streams are around the 5 and 10 year storms. So, but if what we're saying is that we're going to see more extreme events in the future, does that start? We start needing to ask the questions: do we need to rethink our infrastructure? But if you think that's expensive when you've already built the infrastructure, if you're going to get back into changing values, that's a whole new thing. We really only have, and you can maybe think about our time management and our financial resources. You can kind of think of that as a wallet or something, where you've got one compartment that's got money in it, and then other compartments in there about everything from internally what you do in this field, from your career development to maybe managing projects, managing organizations, to connecting and networking within the water community. Hopefully you're doing some of that at our conferences. But when you're thinking about that balance between how much your attention you're paying to the financial resources versus the time that you have, and we've had a number of our great water leaders. Eric Wilkinson is getting ready to retire here shortly, and we'll miss him. But as we're thinking about the time that our professionals have to spend on different things, it's limited. And that balance is constantly changing about whether your investment in your own career and your investment with your organization and your investments of time on behalf of the broader water community. It's always a fluid thing. So with that, I think we're going to consider, as we're looking at stream management planning, watershed planning, this is incredibly complex. And you're managing and dealing with interrelationships on oftentimes a very large number of goals. If you look at the section in the Colorado Water Plan about what steps you have to go through, Nicole shared that with the panel here. Holy smokes, there's like 12 things in there, and all of which are really time consuming. And so there's only so much time and energy that we have to put into that. And with that, Nicole, maybe tell us a little more about stream management planning and our challenges ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. So if the Colorado Water Plan is our roadmap to achieving balance in water use in the state of Colorado, stream management plans are one tool that the water plan promotes to achieve some environmental and recreational goals. The Colorado Water Conservation Board has set aside $5 million. The original goal was to set aside $5 million for 3 years for the Watershed Restoration Grant Program. And at the board meeting on Monday and Tuesday, they granted $3.5 million through that grant program to help move forward watershed planning and restoration projects throughout the state. We now have, after Monday's board funding decisions, we now have stream management plans that are going to be moving forward in 7 of the 9 different geographic areas under the Basin Roundtables. And so we're seeing stream management plans really start to move forward in many, many parts of the state. In some of those large basins, you have one on one small stretch of stream, and some of them you'll have stream management plans on several sub-basins, and then some of the basins are actually doing larger plans for the entire basin. When I explain what a stream management plan is to people, in my mind, its goal really is to produce a science-based assessment of what a river needs to be functionally healthy. And then on that science-based assessment, you overlay existing and future water management practices, and then you look for opportunities for voluntary and collaborative changes in both infrastructure and management structures of water management in a given reach of stream to improve those environmental and recreational conditions. That can be a scary prospect for a lot of people because I think to make any real meaningful progress to pursue some environmental and recreational goals, you're often going to have to look at how water has been historically used and managed in a stretch of stream. And then you're going to have to think about how you could collaboratively and voluntarily make adjustments to that to improve stream health. So I am generally an eternal optimist. And so I believe that we can make changes to how we allocate and manage water in some stream reaches in the state. Obviously, this isn't going to work everywhere. But I think it doesn't have to be a series of win-lose decisions, and it doesn't need to be a zero-sum game. I think there are opportunities within the state, and we're seeing some stream management plans come forward with recommendations that are now starting to be implemented and are going to make a difference over the next 3 to 5 years, and they will benefit both water users and the environment. And so I really do applaud the Colorado Water Conservation Board for putting forward this opportunity to communities in the state. And then we have a lot of leaders in our state who have now said, this is something that we can do in our basin and we're going to try it. And there are a lot of people who have stepped forward to lead these processes, not really knowing what they're getting into. For those of you who are involved in these stream management plans so far, you know that there are fits and starts and they are hard. And it requires a lot of different values and goal settings processes that can open up a lot of challenging conversations. In my mind, that's really good. And so my hope is that as we implement more of these plans across the state and we start to see, getting closer to that water plan goal of 80% of locally prioritized streams with watershed plans, I really hope that we can, as a community, see value in these processes. And so throughout 2018, I'll be leading a number of educational workshops, and I'll be hand-holding a number of communities as they initiate this process, and we'll be developing some guidance and best practices across the state. And the speakers that you have up here today will give us a little bit of their perspective on what they think stream management plans could be accomplishing or should maybe be wary of as we move forward.
Great, thanks, Nicole. So our first speaker is Robert Crafasi, who spent some time with Boulder as counties? City of Boulder's Open Space. He has written the best book on water I've ever read, right there. A Land Made from Water, Appropriation and the Evolution of Colorado's Landscape Ditches and Water Institutions. It's one of the most readable, there's a lot of books on water out there, but this is one of the most readable books and real books that I think I've ever read on water. So I encourage people to get a copy of that book. And with that, Robert, we'll just turn it right over to you and lead us through your messages there.
Well, thank you, Doug, for those very kind words. It's a real privilege to be here at the Water Congress. It's a great group of people and some familiar and friendly faces in the crowd, so that's a plus. Where I come from with water is I like to think of things in a historical perspective, and I've a little bit about my background in environmental science and geology have given me the long view on water development and how to manage things. And so I came from looking at things like that. And then I also had the advantage of working with a lot of little ditch companies in Boulder Valley and seeing a lot of their old records and things like that to understand where they came from, who built the ditches, and so on. So it generated a real interest in me in understanding how Colorado's water systems developed. And I think that there is a very logical and rational development timeline that has occurred. But it's also greatly affected our rivers. So without much ado, I will start getting into it a bit. Essentially, my talk will be an overview about how water development and riparian development, so we're not just talking water projects, but the entire suite of riparian activities that we've done has changed the way we see the world and what has occurred out there. Our landscape that we've created is natural and artificial, man-made, at the same time. There's really no going back to an Edenic past, somewhere that didn't exist. Thinking of the gold rush as day zero for the beginning of development is really incorrect. And if you keep some of those things in mind, what is occurring on our rivers perhaps will make a little bit more sense. We've transformed the landscape dramatically. And before even these drawings were occurred, this is on the Cache la Poudre back in 1869. There were 10,000 years of active people coming in and out of this landscape. They found the cache of Clovis spearheads in Boulder. There are game walls up in the Indian peaks that are 6,000 years old. The Indians regularly burned the forest and burned the prairies. They hunted out the megafauna. They hunted the deer and the antelope. So all of those things had active effects on the landscape, including the river corridors. So when the white people walked on the scene, first the Spanish and then the Americans, it was already adapted and changed. Now, one of the first Americans to come up the South Platte was Long. We've named a peak after him. And that was in 1821. He came up the South Platte, crossed through what is now Denver, and then over to the Arkansas, and then back down. And one of the things he wrote on the map that he said was the Great American Desert. And there's an example of his map from 1821. One of the things in his report back to the east was that there was no chance for civilization developing here in Colorado. Some people may still agree with that, but, and if you've ever seen a fraternity at CU or something, you might really agree with that. But, there are these things that have occurred. One of the folks that came through was with the Hayden expedition, and some of these drawings were from Henry Elliott, and he was an artist with the expedition. And these never made it into the expedition reports, but they're at the USGS. And you get a sense of what some of the landscape looked like before there was a lot of construction occurring. This is a little bit north of Boulder, looking south towards the Flatirons. In the early 19th century, before the gold rush, there was a lot of activity occurring up and down Colorado's streams. The trappers and hunters are more famous in the Pacific Northwest, John Jacob Astor and that. However, a lot of that stuff happened in Colorado earlier and intensively. The Bent's Fort, St. Vrain, those folks built various trading forts with the Indians. The Indians trapped beaver, everything that they could lay their hands on, and that started a more intensive cycle of stream change. Then came the buffalo hunters through the 1820s to 1880s. And I mentioned the buffalo because they were grazing the Great Plains. They were down there in the riparian areas grazing stuff. And when they were eliminated, the kind and character of the megafauna that was out there changed. We removed the buffalo and then added cattle. So that also created changes in the vegetation and structure. Hunters shot and removed virtually every animal that they could lay their hands on besides the buffalo. We're talking elk, deer, antelope, and again, those were animals that also resided in the riparian corridors and changed things. Of course, when the settlers came in, they didn't come in by themselves. They, of course, brought dogs and cats and horses and oxen, but they also brought some unwanted guests that then occupied the stream corridors. And again, that started to have various kinds of changes and adaptations in what kind of ecology was there. In the 1860s, we started to do intensive activities towards mining, diverting water to do hydraulic mining. They were running that down flumes, putting mercury into the water, removing that, burning it off with who knows what kind of effect on the miner. That stuff was going back into the stream. Later on, they were using cyanide leach mines in Boulder County. There were at least 15 cyanide leach pits around the county, and I know that that occurred up and down the Front Range and in the mountain districts. So that was also having effects on the stream corridors. When they were doing the hydraulic mining, they were either dumping it into the creek or the hydraulic mining, again, making those kinds of changes. So that was changing the geomorphology that was available for people. Settlement brought other changes. They needed wood, they needed fuel, they needed transportation. So those kind of activities started to become very popular. They were removing trees, they were burning trees for coke and for charcoal. So that was changing things. Here's a photograph, and I have not been able to figure out specifically where. So if anyone recognizes this spot, I would love to hear from you. But this is somewhere north of Denver. One of the rivers where they did tide drives. Virtually every river from South Boulder Creek to the Wyoming line had active tide drives. And 1/3 to 3/4 of all trees in the Front Range were removed by the 1880s and 1890s. 1/3 to 3/4 of all trees were removed. And you could imagine the kind of impact that that had on entire watersheds. It changed the hydrology, it changed the timing of water going back, it changed erosion, many, many things. Here's a photograph of another Front Range tide dive. They were cutting these logs, running them down the creek. Many of them were for railroad construction. So they were using that not only for the Intercontinental Railroad, but for all of the other railroads that were constructed around Colorado in the late 19th century. So really, because of the tree cutting, we really don't know with any certainty what pre-development conditions looked like with any certainty. We have various letters from settlers, from people coming up the South Platte, but we don't really have any good ecological data about what the early stream conditions and riparian conditions were. Of course, we began building ditches. This is probably up on the Cache la Poudre. And I just have to give a little aside. When I showed this picture to Bob Carlson of Boulder Water Commission, he said, they're smiling because they're shutting it off for the season. But anyhow, this was the sort of thing that was occurring. They were building flumes, they were building diversion structures by piling rocks in the river, logs and things like that. It wasn't until after the 20th century that you started to see large amounts of diversion dams being built with concrete and more advanced materials. In general, in Colorado, the irrigation went from 35,000 acres to nearly 3.2 million by the mid 2000s. And so again, we're talking about huge changes to the landscape surrounding our watersheds, and all of that has impacts on the stream, with sediment, with chemical changes, with irrigation changes, and so on. I'll show you a couple of little slides from Boulder Creek and South Boulder Creek, where I know the area the best. But one of the things that occurred, right out of the box, is they started to do direct flow appropriations. And within about 5 years, from 1859 to 1864, essentially every single drop of direct flow appropriation was consumed. And if you look at this graph, you see how it flattens out. There's a couple of big bumps where there were reservoirs constructed, but essentially the direct flow appropriations took everything. And they were therefore drying up the streams below and changing the hydrology. With that, it became very obvious, very fast, that if you wanted to continue doing development, you had to start building reservoirs. Back then, they called them artificial lakes. I believe Church Ranch Lake on 36 may be the oldest reservoir in the South Platte Basin. Pancast Reservoir up near the power plant in Boulder was the second. So they started to build these smaller structures. They started to build ditches to fill them during the winter season and spring to capture the snowmelt. But again, you can see on this that there was a very rapid appropriation of non-direct flow rights, and this replicates itself on every single creek around Colorado. And of course, what the net result is that we've got a spaghetti-looking network of ditches and reservoirs and interconnected stuff. This looks a little bit like a circuit board in its complexity, the straight line diagram for the South Platte, and it looks that way for every one of these other ditches. So that just gives a sense of how we've rewired the hydrology in a global sense around the watershed. Of course, all of this ditch digging has changed how the water goes across the landscape. I maintain that we've created a new oasis. It's spread it out by all of these ditches, and you look at the various communities, and you can see how these ditches have moved water away, and all of those return flows have changed the hydrology and so on. All of that has led to the creation of various wetlands and other water communities that rely on that. Here's an image from Davidson Ditch, and you could just see from the coloration how it's a little odd. On the upper half is what's downhill in this particular image, but you could see how it's darker because it's greener and there's irrigation going on. And if you superimpose on that the kind of wetlands that are present, you'll see that there are no wetlands above the ditch, and all of the wetlands exist below the ditch. So we've created these wetland ecologies through our ditch construction and our water management that had never existed. If you go above the ditch, you'll find cactuses and other prickly pears and things like that. Below the ditch, you'll be finding wetland plants and the such. Here's another photo. These ditches weren't just from direct irrigation, but the ditches around were also seeping. And they're creating wetlands below seepage sites. And those things, have value. Those are wetlands. They're something to be cherished. There are wetlands that are a function of the irrigation return flows, and where the water collects, the tailwater, that also occurs in those areas. So you see this. This is up at Boulder Valley Ranch. And of course, around all of our lakes, we've got wetlands encircling lakes where there had not been a lake previously. So some very interesting things going on. If you look at the land 50 feet on each side of the ditches around Boulder County, you'll find that about 18 to 20% of Boulder Valley's wetlands are directly related to irrigation ditches. And again, another thing that's happened is we've diverted water out of the creek. A few years ago, I looked at the flows and did a drought repetition evaluation. If you look at El Dorado Springs and look at the drought frequency, you get a certain number, and then you go down to the end of South Boulder Creek, and you'll find that South Boulder Creek, at its tail end, right before it goes into Boulder Creek, experiences the equivalent of a 500-year drought, year in and year out, because the creek has been effectively dewatered. So that's a really interesting thing. One of the odd pieces about that is that it happens to be in the lower section of that creek that a lot of your endemic fishes live, because you don't have brown trout in there that are predating against them. So it's a very complex and interesting situation. Take a look at the various creeks up and down the Front Range, and because of the diversions that we've done, there's been stream narrowing. So we have vegetation encroachment. Occasionally when you have the flood, it'll blast that stuff out, but over years you'll see that the lower end of the streams tend to be a little narrower and more encroached than the upper end before there's a lot of diversions. And that's just the case there on South Boulder Creek. Stream width just demonstrates that. It goes down as you go down the creek. So The other thing, of course, we've done is a lot of municipal development. First, through communities, private development of water projects, then with some state assistance ecosystem that occurred there before. We've also mined out lots and lots of aggregate to build our cities. Here's a photograph in the 1930s on Boulder Creek, and that same location in the year 2000. And you can do that on every other river and in the main stem of the South Platte and see these kinds of dramatic changes to the stream corridors. Again, that's part of our appropriation of riparian resources. We've also changed the water quality with every single wastewater treatment plant that we've installed. Take a look at Metro Sewer in Denver. I'm not pointing fingers, I'm just saying that this is an example of how we've changed things. It's for you to decide whether or not these changes are for good or bad. But take a look in the spring, in the winter here, and it's dominated by effluent, the South Platte River. It's changed because of how we've modified the creek. Far and away, most of the water in the creek as you go down has been utilized either in industry, through cities, or agriculture. It's all been reused at one point or another. We've also moved water from other watersheds, as you all know, across the Continental Divide in ditches and tunnels, adding water to the system, and also creating various changes to the hydrology. One of the most dramatic things, I think, is how many lakes we've built. In Boulder Valley, 99.9% of the surface area of lakes has been man-made. 99.9% of the lakes in Boulder Valley are man-made by surface area. And that replicates up and down the Front Range. When you see the old letters from people coming up when they were pioneers, or like Long, they called it a Great American Desert, in part because there was so little surface water available. So for people attuned to the eastern United States, recognizing lakes and rivers that were perennial coming into this area, it really did seem like a Great American Desert. Many of these lakes were built since the 1870s. Here I've just identified the dates during which the various lakes were constructed. And it's interesting to look in other areas because it just replicates. Our fish introductions and removals are also really telling. Roughly about 1/3 of the fishes in St. Vrain, Boulder Creek, South Boulder Creek are all introduced species. Many of the endemic fishes are rare. Some of them are uncommon, so there's only a few common species. So we've effectively altered the aquatic ecosystems as well. We've removed a lot of the fauna. By the 1880s and 1890s, the gray wolf was gone, the buffalo was gone. Fremont, when he was down near REI in Denver, they actually got attacked by a grizzly bear. Those are all gone. So a lot of the megafauna was completely altered. The otter and mink were trapped out. However, there are some positive stories. Here's a photograph of an otter on Boulder Creek from 2013. They've also had black mink come back in. So some of these things are in flux. So some of the things that occurred in the past that we might have some regrets about have now reversed themselves. Of course, we brought in a lot of new residents that we don't really want. Here's the quagga mussel and Eurasian water milfoil, and we've got a lot of that spreading around, and that creates all other problems. But it also is affecting the ecosystems that we see out there. South Platte River becomes a really interesting story as well. In coming up the river during the 1860s, during the Indian Wars, many of the settlers coming up encountered a dry riverbed in Julesburg and Fort Morgan. In the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, there were multiple years when there was simply no water in the South Platte River. That went on and on. There was one of the folks with the Hayden expedition was noticing that there was, after the ditches were built, that stream flow was going live below areas where it used to. And the various settlers were suggesting, hey, maybe because of the rainfall, we have had a thing that the rain follows the plow. Well, that started up here on the Front Range, and that actually wasn't because rain was following the plow. That was because we were building irrigation ditches. That water was going out into the landscape, and it was seeping back and creating a live stream further down. And on the South Platte River, if you look at the dates where the various ditches were appropriated, all of the earliest appropriations are in the tributary streams, and then they start getting younger as you go out towards the Kansas border. That's because as we were irrigating, that water seeping in, coming back, creating a live stream, and allowing the river to supply people downstream where it had never done that before. Here's a 1929 chart demonstrating that from the Colorado State Engineer. And what it's showing is that over various years, the further down you go, the higher the river flow is in successive years. It became so great that by the 1950s, Ralph Parshall was able to proclaim that there's nearly 1 million acre-feet of year of extra water down in the lower South Platte than had ever existed before that. For that reason, when Colorado negotiated its compact with Nebraska, that's why they set up that break at the Washington state line. It's because they recognized that a lot of water coming down was irrigation return flow. The Nebraska engineers and compact negotiators understood that, as well did Delph Carpenter and the folks from Colorado who did the negotiations on our side. So that river went from being dry, where you could walk across it in the summer, to something that had perennial flows today. Now, all of that has really changed. Here's one of my favorite photos I've ever found in researching this stuff. Here's a photo down near Cozad, Nebraska, and off to the left of that fellow who's pensively looking out over the river is a buffalo skull. Who knows what he's thinking about? You know, the coming railroad or the elimination of the buffalo. But what he is seeing is a wide and flat river on the Platte River. The things that we have out there are a little hard to tease out. Defining our lakes and streams as either natural or artificial, I think that does disservice to ourselves and the environment, because there's more going on here. We are a part of this ecosystem that created these things. We have responsibility. I'm not saying that in any way that we shouldn't be preserving these things. I'm saying we have a responsibility to understand how these things came into existence if we want to understand how we conserve those elements and features in these landscapes that we value. Western civilization really likes dichotomies, either ors. Nature versus society, artificial versus natural, wild or domestic, natural, artificial. You know, it goes on and on. I think that creates political divisions and reinforces political divisions when we look at it so black and white. I think we need to be getting past that and seeing us as one of the drivers for the ecology, and also understand what kind of values we want for these systems. Ecologists define a biological community together with its associated physical environment. Ecologists also define biological communities as the species that occupied a shared locality and the interactions amongst those species. Nowhere in those definitions are human beings excluded. We need to be part and recognize ourselves as part and parcel of the ecosystems we manage. For if we don't, we're overlooking one of the keystone species that exists in this area today. again, doesn't give us a free rein to do what we want. It gives us the charge to carefully examine our values and understand how we're changing things. It also requires us to understand where we've come from in order to understand where we want to go. I call these kind of ecosystems that we've created up and down the South Platte hybrid ecosystems. Others use various names. I like the word hybrid because I think it really identifies the kind of interactions between people and the environment and ongoing things. We've done a lot of stuff deliberately. We've done a lot of stuff incidentally. The nature continues to do its thing, and so there's these interactions that are occurring. It's all about values. Recovering the past, some Edenic past, I don't frankly think is necessarily possible. But I think we can identify those elements that we want to preserve and actively go after doing that. I think that we have to recognize, too, that these ecosystems are transient and that we're part of the reason they're transient. So there's a paradox in here. Conservation of hybrid ecosystems, the rivers we're talking about, may require active management by people. If we walk away and do nothing, that's as much of an active endeavor as if we go out and create a dam. After all, we've done all of these changes, we've set all of these things in motion, so we can't ignore the fact that we're actively engaged here. So I'll just make a couple of conclusions. These ecosystems include people. Hybrid lake and stream ecosystems are co-produced by people, nature, incidentally and deliberately. These ecosystems are transient. They're constantly changing, and we have to be cognizant of that. Nolan here described how the climate has been changing over the years. That's just another element in this that we have to understand and pay attention to. We live in a man-made oasis. There's no going back to some nostalgic past. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. It's fascinating. Okay, Nicole, you want to introduce our next speaker?
So I met Peter Skidmore with the Walton Family Foundation in, June of last year on a 5 or 6 day Yampa River trip that American Rivers and the Friends of the Yampa puts on every year. And Peter has developed a real interest through his work with the Walton Family Foundation in Colorado, and he'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's been a real pleasure to get to know what I think is one of the great minds in river and riparian restoration in the United States, and we're lucky to have him be interested in working with us in Colorado.
Thank you. Hello, everybody, and thank you, Doug and Nicole, for inviting me to be here today. It's a real honor and a privilege, my first Colorado Water Congress conference. I started out my career in rivers, doing reconstructive surgery on river systems as a restoration scientist. I'm a geologist by background. And over the past 25 years, I've moved into sort of bigger and bigger systems and bigger scales of influence. And all I've really learned through all of this progression of getting bigger and bigger about everything is things just get more and more complicated. One of the things that Bob just pointed out, though, is it's so hard to differentiate between natural and human anymore in our landscape. But regardless of those distinctions, we do have some choices. And so what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, right now, is a framework for making some of these decisions and some choices about our river systems. There it is. So yes, I work with the Walton Family Foundation, and this is a family-led foundation, and they focus on really big challenges, reforming education and fixing sustainable fisheries in the oceans and addressing major river systems. We're working on the Mississippi River and the Colorado River. The family tackles big challenges. So in the rivers realm of the foundation's work, we're protecting rivers, and we have a real focus on the communities that depend on those rivers. And so we operate in this philosophy that the solutions have to make economic sense to be sustainable and to last over time. As I said, we're working in the Mississippi River and the Colorado, and in the Colorado River, we're really focused on creating market-based management systems. And then specifically as part of the Colorado River, in the state of Colorado, we're looking at creating water trading mechanisms, and we're doing a lot of restoration work on restoring flows and restoring riparian habitat. So this is my area of focus. The last part is I focus my part of that work on the restoration of flows and riparian habitat. So in this talk, I'm going to cover 3 areas. One is this healthy rivers premise, and the premise being that we all have this ideal of maintaining healthy rivers. Excuse me. And then the second part of the talk, I'm going to give a little summary of the state of our rivers today, nationally, in the West, and in the state of Colorado. And then I'm going to talk a bit about this river management spectrum, or this framework for making choices. So the Healthy Rivers premise. This panel is focused on stream management planning, and the premise behind stream management planning actually includes the phrase healthy rivers. We want to have healthy rivers such that they benefit recreation and for ecosystem function, while also providing for consumptive water uses. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about, well, what is a healthy river? How do we define a healthy river? This is my own definition. I've changed it every time I've given a talk. This is the most current version. In my own words, a healthy river is one where natural processes support the full complement of river services for people and wildlife. What do I mean by river services? This is not my own thinking portrayed here, but this is a framework of ecosystem services is another way of thinking about it, but I've narrowed it down to river services. There are really 4 categories of services that a river system provides for us. One category is regulating services. You think of this as flood abatement and water purification, where a river actually regulates the highs and lows in the system and provides some consistency that's of value to us. A second set of services is the provisioning services. And this is where the river actually provides things that we take and use of value. So for water for ag production, drinking water, and actually fisheries, and like food fisheries, not just recreational fisheries, but food fisheries. And the third set of services is cultural services. And the easiest way to categorize cultural services is just the way we enjoy a river. We recreate. Some of us sit on the bank and get a spiritual value out of it, and educational values. So things that we do as a society and the values we derive in that way. And then the last set is supporting services. And this is really just supporting those ecosystem values. So supporting habitat, supporting primary production. So I'm going to use this phrase of river services quite a bit through the rest of the talk. I just wanted to give this overview. It's really all the different things we derive from a river, whether it's habitat, or hunting, or fishing, or providing clean water for drinking, or ag production. So what is a healthy river from an ecological perspective? Healthy rivers, one of the greatest variables, I think most important variables to think about in terms of ecological health is complexity. So if you think about all the different wildlife that exists within a river or a wildlife corridor, lots of different species, lots of different life forms. The thing that they need is to be able to find really specific habitat conditions to meet whatever stage of life they're in. The more complexity, the more variability within a system, the greater potential to provide that need for the wide range of species. So ideally, river systems are variable and complex, and what makes them variable and complex is disturbance, floods and erosion, trees falling in the river, log jams, all these things that can be a nuisance, beavers, all these things can be a nuisance and make rivers really messy. They're actually good from an ecosystem services perspective. They're really good from an ecosystem support perspective. In the upper corner there, there's a diagram of riparian succession. So a riparian forest is fundamentally disturbance-based. A lot of species of cottonwood will only reproduce through flood cycles that create fresh sand surfaces for the seedlings to grow. So without that erosion, without those flood disturbances, you won't have that natural riparian progression. You can also look at a healthy river from a physical perspective. All these pictures, these satellite images here of these rivers, these are all, quote, healthy rivers. They're all, quote, stable rivers. Even the one over there that says braided, where there's 300 little rivulets across a sandy bottom and they're shifting all the time. It is stable in a geologic context. It's not changing over time. It's moving around a lot, but over time, it's really not fundamentally changing. So we call that a stable river, even though it's whacking around back and forth. So from a physical perspective, we just have to keep in mind that healthy rivers, natural rivers, come in many different forms, and it's important to consider that form when we think about management solutions. So now let's talk a little bit about the state of our rivers nationally and more locally. This table shows different classes of organisms that are at risk. So these are threatened, endangered, and at-risk species. And the top 5 classes of organisms nationally at risk are all freshwater river species. So our rivers are really the most imperiled ecosystems in the country. On the right, there's also a diagram of a trend over time of riparian forest, and you can see that over time we're losing riparian forests, and they're becoming more fragmented and smaller over time. In some of the southwest states, like in Arizona in particular, we've lost 90 to 95% of the historic riparian forests. And even though Bob showed us this incredible picture of that reverse trend on the Platte, nationally, the trend is that our riparian forests are really diminishing. If we zoom in a little bit closer to the west, western rivers are doing a little better than the rest of the country on some metrics. These are EPA metrics. If we look at macroinvertebrates and fish, western rivers are doing as well or better than the rest of the country. But again, if we zoom in on riparian disturbance, our western rivers are actually more depleted than the rest of the country. And then zooming down a little further into the state of Colorado, this is really literally hot off the presses study that we commissioned looking at physical impacts to rivers in Colorado. All the little diamonds, I'm not sure how well they show up there, but that's 3,000 plus permitted impacts, permitted by the Corps of Engineers, that represent permanent impacts to the river system. Over 3,000 in the last 5 years, and only 200 of those required any form of mitigation. So this is just another sort of perspective on the new frontier of river impact is death by 1,000 cuts of these little physical impacts. So that was the glass half empty talk, right? I'm going to shift now into the glass half full. The state of our rivers is not great from an ecological perspective. And I think we're all aware of that. It's kind of a factual thing. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about stream management planning with a more optimistic and hopeful bent. This is what I refer to as my stream management spectrum. It's a spectrum of community interests and goals, and it's also a spectrum of river health. So on the far left side, we have just envision maximum river health, so pre-European disturbance or wilderness rivers. And on the far right, minimum river health, think the LA River. And so we can use that to also think a little bit about how are the different ways that we use the river in terms of benefiting from its services relate to this river health. Generally, as we go from a healthy river in an ecological sense, as we move from a very healthy system to a less healthy river system, we have a smaller and smaller range of services that river will provide to us. Okay, so in a pristine river system, the potential is 100% on all those different types of, all 4 categories of services. But as we lose river health, we start to lose some of that potential. And if we think about the major drivers for moving us away from that healthy river condition, it's in Colorado, really. It's water use, and it's infrastructure, and it's floodplain development. These are the things that are impacting our river. And as a particular river system feels more and more impact from water use, we start to lose that river health, and it narrows the services that we're getting from that river. In Colorado, I would say that almost all of the rivers that we have here in Colorado fit in this yellow box somewhere, right? We're not, there's really hardly any rivers in Colorado where you're at the pristine pre-human condition. As Bob was saying before, every river in the state has been impacted in some way. So we're not on the far left. We're also not on the far right in most of these systems. We're somewhere in this middle ground. And that's an okay place. No judgment, just sort of factually, I think that's where we are. So I'm going to finish up this talk with a couple core principles, at least the way I think about core principles of managing rivers to maintain health, to find a balance between the services we derive, those provisional services, and some of the other services that we hope to continue to derive, such as recreation and ecological services. So these are, I'm going to cover 3 principles. The first, in terms of managing rivers, how do you think about managing a river? What sort of conversations do you have around managing a river? I think you have to start first with the context, in a watershed context. You think of a river in the context of its entire watershed. So I talked before about a river being a physical entity. It's governed by the geology of the watershed, the hydrology of the watershed, the vegetation of the watershed. And depending on that set of variables, you end up with an inherent river character, a type of river. It might be single thread, it might be braided, it might be somewhere in between. So there's that context, like what is the inherent physical character of the river? There's also the sort of the existing water infrastructure context. There are already diversions, there's dams, there's lakes, there's all sorts of water infrastructure in place. That's critical context to consider in thinking about management options down the road. And then there's the land use context as well. How is the land in the watershed being used, and how is that affecting the river, and what sort of opportunities or constraints does that put on our management? So those are the 3 bins of context that I think we need to start with in considering river management. The second principle is just generally minimizing constraints on the river wherever possible. I said before that one of the most important variables in terms of the ecological health, and then that translates into spiritual, aesthetic, recreational services that we derive. One of the most critical variables to consider is that complexity, is variability in the river system, and we get that through disturbance, letting the river be a river on some level. And so we can do that by minimizing constraints. And what do I mean by constraints? I mean river crossings, points of access, pipelines, riprap, diversions, dams, all of those different human constructed elements serve to constrain the river and its movement and its dynamic process. So what we want to try and do, I suggest, as a general management philosophy, is minimize those points of constraint. Not necessarily take them away, but if we can, consolidate them in as few places as possible and leave as much room as possible for the river to be a river. And then the third is very much related to that, is to think about a river as a corridor, not just a channel. We often think of the river as just the wetted part, right, with the fish in it. I think of a river as a corridor system that includes its riparian and floodplain system. As a geologist, certainly, a river is more than just a channel. It includes its floodplain. So I encourage all of us to just start to think of rivers more as something that goes well beyond the banks of the channel out into the floodplain. So again, those are my principles. Those are things that I've sort of over years and years of consulting and thinking about how to manage river systems, how to work with variable interests, how to accommodate lots of different interests and ideals. These are the things I think we can focus on in the stream management planning process. So with that, I'm going to end, and thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Peter. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, then I'll ask Nicole to do the one after. We had Allison was not feeling quite well today, so Tony Koski is going to fill in for her. And so Tony's going to talk a little bit. Our next couple of speakers, a little shorter talks, will be focusing on water in the landscape. And Tony's going to talk about water in the urban landscape.
Okay, thanks for staying first. Okay, okay. Yeah, my name's Tony Koski. I'm the faculty at Colorado State University in the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture, and I'm the extension turf specialist for the state. So you're probably wondering, how the heck am I going to connect with stream management? I'll show you how. Okay, so. But I'm here because Allison isn't feeling quite well, and she asked me to pinch hit for her. So I'm one of the co-authors on this paper that Allison and Zach Johnson, one of our colleagues also in my department, wrote. And this was at the request of our green industry. A couple of years ago, they came to us and asked us if we could write something looking at the research literature, documenting the benefits and what we decided to call the hidden benefits of landscapes. And this was after they'd seen a similar paper written by colleagues at University of California during California's drought. And they wrote their paper trying to document benefits of green landscapes. And of course, during California's drought, one of the very first targets, if you will, of let's turn the water off on landscapes, and that's going to save the state, which they found didn't happen. But rain did, okay? And they came to us and said, could you write something similar to this? And we said, we could write something better than that. So ours, we think, is better. And so it is available on the internet. This is the greatest Google search. If you just Google hidden value of landscapes, it's the #1. I guarantee it'll be the #1 in every search engine. So we named this thing very well. It's easy to find. So, and what we're our intention is to demonstrate that landscapes that we live in and we're part of, and I like some of the comments that people are part of the environment, not apart from the environment, and a lot of times you hear that we're like invaders from some other planet or something. And these landscapes that we live in, that we build, that we create, you know, golf courses, parks, our home landscapes, the landscapes around our businesses, that there's an environment there that we're living in. And our goal was to demonstrate that they're more than just pretty things to look at. They're more than just a place to hire somebody to mow the grass. It's more than a waste of water to water a lawn or your vegetable garden or your flowers or your tomatoes. That there's some real value to those landscapes besides what sometimes we read about, okay? And the point is not to say that we don't want to conserve water. And if you worked in our industry like we do, we're always preaching this. I was just at a conference this morning teaching about how to manage landscapes with less water. So we do that constantly within our industry, and we're very proud of what we do. But we don't think our message gets out very well. And again, we think often people look at us like, oh, you're pretty, you're expendable. If we turn the water off, that's okay. There are higher and better uses of water. And what we wanted to demonstrate with our paper was that there are a lot of values to landscapes that people don't think about, maybe consciously, and we want to kind of bring those to people's attention and get people to think a little bit more about the landscapes that we live in. So we looked at things like the economic value, the environmental value, the value to human health, and not just physical health, but our mental health, well-being, the ability to heal people. So one of the things kind of one of our little buzzwords is, and we even had t-shirts made up, ask me about the 3%. So what we looked at, and we had all these numbers confirmed, and we went by every water engineer, Reagan Wascom, we all did the math over and over and over again, but about 3% of the water that originates in Colorado is used for irrigating what we call green landscapes, okay? And so that's our motto, is ask me about the 3%, and I'll tell you what your return on investment in that 3% is, okay? And that's the gist of this paper, and it's very long. It's got lots of documented research papers, so if you want to find the origins of what we write about in here, we've got them right at the end of that document. So, yeah, we think and it is, actually it's not very long. It's in little, very edible bits of information. But we do recognize that we're getting more and more people, and there are more and more in the urban environment, and we use water for all kinds of things, inside the house, outside the house. And we have to find ways of using that water more efficiently. And so that's what we do. That's what Allison does. That's what I do. Teaching in our classes, doing extension talks. We try to teach people how to manage those landscapes more efficiently, whether it's the way they irrigate, the technology they use, the plants they put in their landscapes, that type of thing. So, and the point is that the more we can conserve in what we do, the better we'll be prepared when we do have droughts, and we're always going to have droughts. I mean, we live in a drought, but then we have the real extreme droughts. And so thank goodness it's been snowing in the mountains a little bit, because we were already starting to hear whispers about water restrictions on landscapes. So, and that still may happen. We don't know. So we talk about in this document is all these other values of landscapes that some of them you could put a dollar value on, and others it's more difficult because it's quality of life stuff, and how do you put a value on some of those things? Just the ability to, if you're a little kid, to go out and play in a nice lawn or a park rather than on asphalt or concrete or something like that. So effects on crime, again, people's well-being, those type of things. And so it was amazing when we did the literature review, and this took us quite a bit of time. I think it even surprised us, the work that other researchers are doing, looking at urban landscapes and parks and trees and how that affects people's quality of life, stuff that we kind of knew, but it's like, wow, people have actually documented this, and that there are these benefits to green landscapes. The ability, so climate change, whatever you want to call it. We don't want to get into that again, do we? But the idea of carbon sequestration. Plants are very good at taking carbon dioxide out of the air, and we can store carbon in our own personal landscapes. And so we've got documented, we've done research at CSU and a number of other researchers, universities, that you can offset your own personal carbon footprint, depending on how you measure that, by about 2%. That your personal home landscape can offset your personal carbon footprint by about 2%. And that includes all the maintenance. That includes the mowing, the watering, fertilizing, everything you do to that landscape. It's a net gain in stored carbon. So landscapes, from that perspective, are good for the environment. If you look at that landscape, not a good place to play if you're a little kid, or if you're a dog, or just about anybody, So that's literally kind of, rocks and yucca. But that's the kind of thing we saw starting happening in California, the Cash for Grass programs, we called it. And it visibly changed the aesthetics of neighborhoods. It changed temperatures in neighborhoods. There were a lot of unforeseen, unintended consequences of those Cash for Grass programs. So, and that's part of our paper, is like, if you do this, this could be the result. So when you look at a landscape like that, I have to figure out how to go backwards here, versus that, here's the stream flow connection. Okay, so when it rains and it falls on that landscape, what's going to happen with that water? Is it going to be absorbed very well? Probably not, because those of us that work with landscapes, we know that there's probably plastic under all that rock. Yeah, so then what's going to happen? It's going to run off into the street. It's all hardscape, basically. It's not going to infiltrate into the soil. Going to go down the storm grates. That goes into a river. That's probably not very clean water. Versus falling on a landscape like that, it gets absorbed, infiltrates into the soil. You get some return flows into aquifers. Eventually that ends up in a stream. But at least it slows down the flow, and it may filter some of that water. So we think that that's a better landscape, that's a better surface for rain to fall on than that one. Okay? This type of thing. This is a big thing with landscape architects and landscape designers, and we teach students how to design these type of features in landscapes to slow down, again, that return of water to eventually going into a stream, going into an aquifer, going into a lake. And the idea is that plants are really good at cleaning up that water, okay? So that's kind of our connection to the whole stream flow thing. And when you look at pictures like that, I mean, that's, you know, when water falls on that landscape and it hits those trees, it hits that turf, it has a much better chance of being cleaned up. You're going to get less sediment and all kinds of other gunk. That's a scientific term, getting washed into rivers. So trees, green landscapes increase property value. And that's something that they found in California. So they let all those lawns die. And when the lawns died, what went next? The trees that were getting irrigated by when people irrigated the lawns, and then the trees died. And so then they were going and spray painting the lawns because it gave them better curb appeal. When people were driving by, should I buy that house? No, that one's got a dead lawn. Well, we'll paint it green. It looks alive. So this just shows that curb appeal is very important. It plays an important role in the perceived value of a home. Just quality of life, places to play, recreate, play with the dog, play with the kids, have soccer games, throw the frisbee around, play golf if you're a golfer. All those values, it's hard to put a dollar figure on what that does for you as a human being, what it does for your kids growing up. But there is value in that. There is value. Exercise, okay? So Allison likes to talk about, and she teaches classes on this, and for folks that have Alzheimer's, there's just, we've got a horticultural therapy major in our department teaching kids how to work with folks with disabilities, just all these different physical problems that people may have, that working in a garden, just being able to walk in a garden or plant a tomato and take care of it, it does something for you as a person. It's beneficial. But that all takes water. That all takes water. And so the point we're trying to make with all these values is just don't think of a landscape as something green. That's the first place we should be cutting water when we have water restrictions. We want to do our share, but it should not be number one on the target. That there can be unforeseen problems if you just totally turn the faucet off. One of them is crime. And this is the most fascinating part of the green landscape thing, is when you look at sociologists, and they can do all kinds of things with GIS, and so they could look at a city, and one of the best papers I saw was that they looked at Phoenix, Arizona, where there's not a lot of green stuff, but in places where there were more parks and more trees and more golf courses and that type of thing, the crime rates in those areas were much lower than in those parts of the city that was devoid of green, of tree canopies, of parks and that type of thing. So now they're trying to figure out ways to actually plant parks and trees in those parts of the city, because it's been documented that when you have green infrastructure, you have lower crime rates. It does something positive, I guess, to the psyche of a criminal when they run into a tree. So, got to figure out what that is. But just another reason trees are good, right? And then in our paper we talk about those unintended consequences of if you take these landscapes out, what kind of bad things can happen. So this is just an example. Not only is that one ugly landscape that people paid a lot of money to put in, but here's the problem, is they stop watering the lawn and then the trees die. So it's great work short-term for arborists because they get to go in and prune these trees down, but then what happens? No more shade in that house. So your air conditioning bills go. So there's these kind of this ripple effect. It make you feel good to take your lawn out, but there could be some problems down the road with the rest of that landscape. Yeah, so just a place for your dog to roll around. They don't like to roll around on gravel. You probably noticed that, okay? What it ended up doing in parts of California gave this very disjointed look to neighborhoods. This one would be rocks and yucca. This one would still be a regular landscape. And so you drive down the street, and it's like, this is a weird neighborhood, all these different types of landscapes. So there were some consequences they didn't anticipate. So most people live in urban areas. So in their yard, in their park, growing their tomatoes on their deck, that might be their only connection with nature when you think about it. They see a butterfly land on the petunia in their planter box, that kind of thing. And that, for many kids, that's their way. That's how they connect with nature. Not everybody goes to Rocky Mountain National Park every weekend, okay? So their backyard, their front yard might be the way that they connect with nature. So then the other thing that we talk about in here is our industry has been very proactive since the big drought back in the early 2000s. That was our incentive to develop best management practices for our green industry. They were written by the green industry and by Colorado State University, and we preach these, we teach about them all the time. We just hammer into people's heads best management practices, how to fertilize and prune and best plant selection and all that type of stuff. And the whole point is, how do you use even less water to maintain those landscapes? Keep them looking nice, yes, but then provide all those other benefits. And even our people in our own industry don't think about those other benefits, which is why we give talks like this over and over and over again. Yeah, and so it makes people feel good. Oh yeah, I'm doing more than making a pretty landscape. I'm making one that's got other values to it. Even in our document, we talk about which areas we think should be prioritized. So when we have to, all do our share, when we have water restrictions, where should we prioritize our water? And that's in the document as well. So we won't go through all those points. One of them, though, is education of people. And so that's what Allison and I do. Part of our job is we're always giving talks. How to use your irrigation system more efficiently, how to use technology, all that type of thing, so that we can use less water to maintain these landscapes. So the idea is we've learned from the past when we had to just shut water off in the early 2000s and our landscapes turned brown. It's like, okay, we got to do better, and we got to educate everyone so that, we can reduce our water use and still have landscapes that are usable and healthy and happy and beautiful for everyone. So that's how we contribute to stream management. So I made the connection there somehow.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Allison did a webinar for us a couple months ago, so that is on our website in its entirety. Next, there you are. Next from the Ag Water Alliance is Greg Peterson, and take us out, Greg.
All right, we're ready? Okay, great. All right, thank you everybody for being here. I'm Greg Peterson. I'm the Executive Director of the Colorado Ag Water Alliance. For those of you who don't know, we're an association of 18 agricultural organizations, and I have to do this since so many board members are in the room. It's Farm Bureau, Farmers Union, Cattlemen's, pork, corn, fruit and veg, potatoes, livestock, wheat, aquaculture, conservation districts, Rocky Ford growers, green industries, Colorado Dairy, Horse Council, egg producers, State Grange, and the Young Farmers Education Association. So we focus on, we focus on educating farmers and ranchers and the general public about water use in agriculture. And that involves going out, talking to farmer and ranchers about water, and pulling people from the cities out onto farms and ranches, and sometimes forcing them to set siphon pipes and learn how ditches operate and just how water is used in agriculture. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the value of water in agriculture and then how that meshes with stream management plans. So I'm going to reiterate some things that I'm sure you've heard before about agriculture, and they need to be said, and I'm going to say them every time I get a chance. And then I'm going to try to highlight some other values of agriculture that maybe we don't necessarily notice as much. So, all right, so agriculture is Colorado's second largest industry. Annually, it's about 41 billion in total output with the agricultural industries and the industries related to it. You have over 172,000 employees. And irrigated agriculture, of the 32 million acres of agriculture in Colorado, 2.5 million is irrigated. So just about 8%. And that 8% counts for about 56% of the production dollars. So we're talking about a very significant amount of wealth that's generated just from irrigated ag itself. And these numbers, they just don't do it justice. I still have a hard time trying to wrap my head just around what these mean. But this is a very significant part of our economy. And just the other things is that it took me a long time to realize that Colorado is an agricultural state. We grow a lot more than pot. I know that might be a surprise to some people, but whether it's sheep, cattle, beans, millet, I had to learn what that was this year, onions, carrots, cantaloupe, that you will often associate this with a state like California, but that Colorado ranks in the top 10 in a wide variety of products. And then outside of just the sheer production, agriculture is pretty much the main industry in a lot of these rural communities, and it supports multiple other industries, whether they're seed dealers, implement dealers, tractor dealers, tire dealerships, banks. This is the center of this is the economic hub for a lot of these communities. And also just for the counties themselves. 11 counties in Colorado, more than 20% of their income comes from taxes on agricultural lands. Weld County, it's about 7 million. And so this is it can be seen that when you start drying up this agriculture, there's a huge effect that this has on all those industries that rely on agricultural activity and also the county itself. So what does this mean for the rest of us? I mean, if you're like me, I'm from Littleton, Colorado, and that's where I still live. And often, rural Colorado agriculture, it seems like this thing that's so foreign, it's so different. You have rural and urban, and they're two different communities, and we don't interact, but we really appreciate what agriculture does, and we want to keep it. But what does agriculture do for us, for those who live in Denver or Colorado Springs, who don't live on a farm, who don't interact with a farmer on a daily basis? And I think that that's really what we need to talk about, especially when we talk about stream management plans, because agriculture does a lot more than what we notice all the time. And so one thing that I want to just hit on is that agriculture makes Colorado beautiful. When you're going out on northeastern plains, on the Pawnee Pioneer Trail, you're looking at agriculture. When you're going up in Boulder County, you're looking at agriculture. Up in Wellington, Troy Seaworth, he's a producer up there. He was at a workshop we did a while ago. Every week, he has people driving up on his farm, just taking pictures. And you're looking at agriculture. Meeker, when you're looking at these irrigated meadows, they would look a lot different if they were dried up. You're looking at agriculture. Monte Vista would look very different without agriculture. Dot Cerro, Grand Valley, agriculture makes Colorado beautiful. It is our playground. When we are hiking, biking, running, camping, hunting, I didn't realize how big of a hunting industry there is, not just in northwestern Colorado. And I've got family who will tell you that you need to hunt out on the eastern plains because they like their elk, they prefer elk that's been eating corn. And this is our playground. And I think that we need to recognize that when you start taking water out of agriculture, it'll look a lot different. And it'll also look very different if it was houses. So I want to just ask a question. How many people have interacted with agriculture today or even this week? Okay. I'm glad I heard a few everybody's there. I have a confession to make. I eat food. I know. I fell into a group of farmers. They're a bad influence on me. Every day I eat food. And I know I'm not the only one. And I know that as the state population increases, as the continued dry up of agriculture, I'm fairly certain we're going to need more food. I'm not a mathematician. I don't know anything about statistics, but I'm fairly certain that we'll have to do that. And as one of my board members in Fort Morgan, a dairy farmer, says, my wife and I aren't drinking all that milk ourselves. Every day we take part in agriculture. Eating is an agricultural act. And I think that's really important to remember as we wonder, well, how important is this for us? Because this seems like a ridiculous question, but as the state population increases, where will future food come from? I mean, King Soopers is not going to run out of food anytime soon, but where is this really going to come from? If you value local food, and I hear that all the time, I hate to say it, but it's not going to come from the urban farms of Denver. It's going to be apples from New Zealand. It's going to be onions from Peru. And you'd think that that would really conflict with this emphasis on having a thriving local agricultural economy. And that's a question that I really struggle with at times, and I think we need to take more seriously is, where is this food going to come from? So I just wanted to then get into stream management plans. So I know this is a bit of an abrupt change, but I want to address a few things with these and try to stay slightly on topic here. So we were sent a bit of the water plan yesterday, a few days ago, about stream management plans and what they are, and it's Section 6 of the water plan, and it doesn't mention the word agriculture. And you see environmental, recreational, inclusive process, and for the past 8 months, 9 months, I've been trying to wrap my head around stream management plans. What are they? What's going on with these around the state? How are they unfolding? What place is there in agriculture for stream management plans? And potentially, there's a lot of good in these plans. And I think that really depends on the process. And there are concerns about these plans. And I think those need to be said, is that farmers and ranchers need to be included from the beginning, and you need to give them a reason to stay involved in these. You can't avoid it. They own the water. And you can try to work around them, and I think that'll really affect how effective these plans are. And you really need to understand their needs and goals. I know that it's convenient to say, well, let's just make it much more efficient, and I wish it was that easy. I mean, one person's tailwater is one animal's habitat. It's not as simple as that. And I think really understanding and getting on the ground and knowing, what do farmers and ranchers actually need? That can go a long way to helping the stream management process. And then also just better understanding the interaction between ag lands and the river, ag lands and other ag lands. That these are actually pretty complex systems. So I wanted to end this with a couple of questions. And we don't really need any answers, and maybe this will come up in the discussion. But how do you gauge your success without agriculture being a key element, especially in areas where agricultural producers own a majority of the water rights? And then, are recreational and environmental goals in stream management plans inclusive of farmers and ranchers' needs to securing their livelihoods? I think these are some really important questions you need to be going forward with. And again, just to reiterate, what are the goals and needs of producers in your watershed? I think it's my understanding that the stream management plans and some parts of the conservation community have come to the conclusion that leasing water is the carrot to entice farmers and ranchers to participate. And I just have to say, leasing water it's the mystery soup. You don't know what you're going to get. And it's not as enticing as it sounds. And I think that leasing water is your goal. And I don't want to confuse that with the goals of farmers and ranchers, which is more in line with production agriculture and being a farmer and rancher. They're not in this business to just be water farmers. That's not their goal. If one thing that I've learned is every farmer and rancher I've met so far, they absolutely love what they do. It's a bit sadistic at times when they'll be out there 6-7 days a week through the night, working constantly. And that's something that you have to grapple with, is these are people who really love their work. And they're not in it to lease water. They're in it to produce food and produce a good product. And they believe in what they're doing. And so when you're talking with farmers and ranchers, it's really holding off on this conversation about leasing water. And I don't know a better way to put this, but you're pretty much proposing marriage on the first date, and you gotta slow things down. I think that really, sets a negative tone where there's actually a lot of places where you can collaborate, whether it's affecting diversion structures, stream bank stabilization, carriage water. There's a lot of common ground that I think the agricultural and the environmental community can work together to benefit agricultural users, but also stream health. And that when you're going into there talking about leasing, that can really scare the conversation. I know that you sometimes joke, oh, these farmers and ranchers, they think we're coming out to take their water. Well, you sound like you're coming out to take their water when you show up and want to talk about leasing. I don't know any other better way to put that. And I think just case in point, you have, I know it just recently came out, the Water Trust, Colorado Water Trust. They approached leasing as a tool 4 years ago in the Crystal River. And 4 years later, they're doing something completely different. They're actually paying a farmer to retime when they're irrigating their fields. And so that's not always the tool. And I think that just going forward, that there's a lot more that we can collaborate on. And it takes a little bit more finesse. And I think that's just all I wanted to say, so thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Well, Nicole, it's happened again. Looks like our speakers are pretty well burned all our time. We had planned on some time for interaction. This has been the longest session we've ever done, I think, at an hour and 45 minutes or so. So thank you all for hanging in there with us on this. Thank you for our panelists, and I thought all did a fantastic job. Nicole, thank you for helping put this panel together, and I'm going to give you the last words if you'd like.
Thanks, Doug. I appreciate that. I think what struck me as I listened to our panelists is it goes back to really the theme of the conference, which is this idea of balance, right? And in my opinion, I see stream management plans as an opportunity to define balance in a new way, to look at the consumptive uses that we have in a river and the services that we want that river to provide to us, both consumptive and non-consumptive and societal, and maybe to step back and take a look and redefine those things. And hopefully we can collaboratively come together, have those hard conversations, and really come out the other end with something that has a little bit more balance in it. And so I know Greg and I have already started to have a lot of conversations about how we can work together. And I really look forward to seeing more of these processes deployed across the state and learning how we can do them right so that they meet the goals of the stakeholders that are involved.